And welcome back to Law and Crime. It is day 3 of Henry Segura's trial in Florida. The state continues its case where prosecutors say Segura brutally killed his girlfriend, Brandy Peters, their 3-year-old child, and Peters' twin 6-year-old daughters. Prosecutors say Segura owed her $20,000 in child support and was cheating on his wife with Peters. Segura says he's innocent, though, and that Peters was the victim of a drug cartel. He says she skimmed drug money and that the cartel even left a calling card when it killed her and her children. The trial should be back live shortly. They are in a lunch break right now. When they come back live, we will take you there. Till then, though, let's talk about Silas Thornton. Earlier today, he testified. He's the defendant's friend. Let's listen to what he said on the stand. All right, so another one of Henry Segura's friends here who says that he is known to have guns. With me today right now to break this all down, Dina Dahl, attorney and trial mediator, as well as Silva Megardician, criminal defense attorney. Thank you both for joining us today. Let's talk a little bit about this gun, because another one of his friends had testified and said that he had known that Segura had a .32 revolver. Here, Silas Thornton also knows that he had guns and was familiar with guns. So we're building and hearing this story that Segura was a gun guy, had guns, talked about it with his friends. We don't know if he was being, braggadocious about it, but we do know friends and people surrounding him knew about these weapons. Silva, weigh in on that first.
Well, it's interesting. It could be seen as both sides. And thank you again for having me on today. The prosecution is going to say this was essentially someone who was very reckless, who talked about his gun ownership, was extremely proud of his gun ownership, and circumstantially used this very rare gun to commit these offenses. I think the defense's argument is going to be, this is Florida. Guns is not something that is odd to own. He bragged about it because he was a legal gun owner. So it can go either way, but it paints a picture about a defendant who was very comfortable with guns, who was braggadocious about his guns, as you said. So yeah, the argument can be used both ways.
All right. Thank you, Silva. And Dina, one of the things that we know is that the other person that testified, the other friend of the defendant, said that he knew he had this .32 revolver. And prior to that, a ballistics expert testified and said that these wounds were consistent with the .32 revolver. So they're obviously trying to draw that connection and connect those dots there. Do you think they are being effective in that sense?
I think the evidence they're putting forward is helpful to the prosecution case. The prosecution has to prove the elements of this crime. One of them is the means. They are trying to show that he had the means, he had the right weapon in order to commit the crime. So I think it's helpful to the prosecution, but it's not as if they have found the actual weapon that committed this crime. They haven't been able to test the ballistics of the bullets to the actual gun. So it's not a slam dunk, but they're putting forth good evidence toward that element.
All right. Dina, Silva, thank you so much. We're going to move on and listen to another part of Thornton's testimony. Let's listen. All right. So this is Silas Thornton, and he says that he talked to Segura, I guess, the morning after the murders, and he details that a little bit. So when we have a witness on the stand here like Silas Thornton, do you think that, obviously aside from the gun, but do you think having these friendships and revealing these things, I guess the relationships that Segura had with Silas in this case is helpful, Silva?
It depends. I mean, in this testimony, it's very interesting. He writes that, he had been shot in the stomach. He was limited in his movements, and he wasn't the greatest shot. Well, that's essential because in this crime, you have a victim that was shot. You have these 2 young children who had to be moved in some capacity. I know they were piled on top of each other in a bathtub. So it's evidence that can show that the defendant was limited in a lot of ways, not the best shot, not someone who could lift heavy objects. So that makes a difference. And also, it paints a picture of who the defendant is, his character of having friendships, people who are loyal to him, people who believe in him and worked with him. So for character evidence, it's nice to see who the defendant is in front of the jury for the defense.
All right, Silva, thank you. And Dina, do you agree with that? I mean, do you think that the character and I guess, building and explaining these relationships helps the defense or the prosecution? All right, so that is Vance Wiggins. He is the manager at the Child Support Program, and he basically confirms that Javante Segura is the son of Brandy Peters and Henry Segura, which we know was unclear at first because during Segura's first interview with police on the day that the bodies were discovered, he said that he even wasn't sure if Javante was his son, but he was going to take care of him, provide him child support, and contribute in the ways he could. But he said at first he wasn't even sure if that was his kid. So when we know this now is his child, Silva, what do you make of that? How does that play into this? And even going back to watching that interview where he was so casual and how he was talking about that being his child and didn't even react, was completely emotionless when that police officer said that your son was dead. How's that all relate here?
Well, it paints such a negative picture about Segura. It just shows that it just paints such a bad picture of him in front of the jury. Someone who really did not want to be the father of this child. The prosecution did a very good job in setting up, as best they could, some kind of motive in this case, showing that, he was forced to make payments for this young man, that he really didn't want this boy to be his. It was very damning testimony because no juror wants to hear that a father wants nothing to do with their kid. And used together his interview with the officers and that lack of any kind of care or connection, along with the fact that he was petitioning the court saying, this is not my kid and I should have never signed that birth certificate, it has a very negative connotation upon this defendant.
Right, and we're going to get to that part in a minute here where he says, I guess he petitioned to say that this is, not my child. I have evidence to prove it. So it's interesting that he's going back on what he said earlier, basically. Dina, talk about that. Talk about, his apathetic nature in the beginning about this being his kid. And now, he did say he wanted to contribute and was going to take care of it. But then we hear him and we find out that he had said that this child isn't mine.
Here's the difficulty with this, is he has actually done something that's kind of morally bankrupt and really messy. He has had a child, and actually, as we know, multiple children out of wedlock. And how he has handled it has been very complicated, right? It sounds like he at times denied that it was his. Whether or not it was as a result of anything his girlfriend said or didn't say, we won't actually know that. But he has tried, as we see here, to determine that he wasn't actually the father. And then in that interview, it seems to me like the prosecution is really using a lot about how he had reacted in that police interview and saying, see, he didn't care enough. He didn't care like a father would. And here now he's also denying paternity in all of these tests. Again, I think we have 4 women, 2 men on this jury. The defense only has to convince one of them of reasonable doubt. Is the prosecution relying too heavily on this idea that he didn't care enough about the child? That's not an element of the crime here. We kind of know he's not a great guy. Whether or not he truly loved this child like a typical parent would, maybe not. But I don't know if that actually makes him, again, guilty of this crime.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it is a big part of the prosecution's case, talking about how his reaction to the news of his son being dead wasn't really the reaction you'd expect. Well, maybe they are making a big deal out of that. We will continue to see and break that down. We're going to take a break right now, though, on Law and Crime. When we come back, hopefully we can take you live to this trial. Stay with us.